So in today's video, we're going to be actually graphing the sine and cosine curves. So yesterday we talked about the attributes of each of the trig graphs. Today we're going to take those attributes and actually place them graphically on the coordinate plane. So let's start with finding all four attributes of this graph. So we should know that the amplitude is going to be 3. The period is going to be 2 pi divided by b. b in this case is 1. So 2 pi divided by 1 would give us a period of 2 pi. There's no phase shift, and there's no vertical shift. So, in order to graph this, we need to remember our acronym for sine. When we're graphing the sine function, remember we start middle, then go high, back to the middle, low, and back to the middle. So, as we're going to put this on our graph paper, the first thing we need to do is we need to label the x-axis. So our scale on our x-axis is going to be by pi over 2. So 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2 would be pi, 3 pi over 2, 4 pi over 2 would reduce to 2 pi. And we could keep going. So in order to graph the sine function, we need to identify where the midline would be, where the middle of our graph would be, where we would put these middle points. So our midline is always going to be on the x-axis unless we have a vertical shift. Since we didn't have a vertical shift, our midline's on the x-axis. Our high value is going to be identified by our amplitude. Our amplitude is 3, so we're going to go up 3 units from our midline to identify where our high point would be. And then we would also go down 3 units from our midline to identify where our low point would be. Now, these purple dashed lines don't represent actually part of the graph. They just identify where my middle, my high, my middle, my low, and my middle points would go. So to sketch this graph, what we're going to do is we're going to start with this first point, the first middle point. We're going to place it at x equals 0 unless there's a phase shift. Since I don't have a phase shift, I'm going to start on the midline when x equals 0. So my first point for the sine graph would go at the origin. Once I've got my first point plotted, I want to go to my last point. My last point is going to be on the middle, and it's going to be the period 2 pi in distance from my first point. So 2 pi in distance is according to our scale 4 spaces. So my last midline point would go at 2 pi. Now I'm going to graph the middle of the 2 points. So my first midline, or my first point on the midline, my last point goes on the midline. Halfway between would also be at a middle point on the midline. So halfway between 0 and 2 pi would be pi. Now I've got these 3 points placed. Halfway between our first 2 middle points is going to be a high. Halfway between 0 and pi would be at pi over 2, at a high. And then we would do our low halfway between the other 2 middle points. So halfway between pi and 2 pi would be 3 pi over 2, and it goes on the low. So now I'm going to sketch my sine curve that looks more like a wave. Again, this is just one period of the graph. I could continue it to the right and to the left following the same pattern. If I was to continue this to the left, I would have from the middle, I would now go low, back to the middle, high, back to the middle. So that would represent another period of this graph. Remember, our domain is all real numbers, so it continues to the left, continues to the right. For now, all I'm going to ask you to graph is one period. Okay, let's try another one. For this graph, we're going to be graphing cosine. Cosine, remember our acronym is high, middle, low, middle, high. So let's identify our attributes and see if we can come up with this graph. Our amplitude is going to be 1. Our period is going to be 2 pi divided by b, or 2 pi divided by 1/2. Changing that to 2 pi times our reciprocal, 2, or 2 over 1, gives us 4 pi. Our phase shift is none. Our vertical shift is none. All right, let's recall. In order to figure out where our midline is, we pay attention to our vertical shift. We don't have a vertical shift, so our midline is going to be on the x-axis. I find my high and my low by my amplitude. My amplitude is 1, so I go up 1 from my midline, and I go down 1 from my midline. From here, we're going to plot our first high point. Since we don't have a phase shift, that means I start when x is 0. So when I start at x equals 0, I've got to start on the high line. Now let's go ahead and label our x-axis. We didn't do that at the very beginning. So our first dash is going to be pi over 2. And since this is so close together, I'm writing my scale at the bottom. My second dash is pi. Then we have 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. We're going to need to keep going because we have a longer period this time. So the next dash would be 5 pi over 2, then 3 pi, 7 pi over 2, and 4 pi. So we should be able to stop at 4 pi since our period is a length of 4 pi, and we started when x was 0. So I've graphed my first point on the high when x is 0. I want to graph my last point on a high 4 pi units from where I started. 4 pi units would be 8 spaces. So at 4 pi, I need to plot another high point. Now that I've got my first and my last plotted, halfway between would be a low. Halfway between 0 and 4 pi is 2 pi, and I'm going to go on the low line. And then halfway between our high and our low is going to be a middle. So halfway between 0 and 2 pi is pi on the middle. And then halfway between our low and our high is going to be on the middle again. So at 3 pi, we're going to put a point on the middle. And we're just going to create our cosine curve. That's like a wave. Remember, it can continue to the left and to the right. We don't want it to go above our high line. It wouldn't continue up, it would continue to the left. So we would follow that same pattern. So if you continued this graph in this pattern, it would look like this. But all you need to graph is one period. So just the blue part would be sufficient. Okay, let's try another one. For this graph, our amplitude is 1. Our period is 2 pi. Our phase shift, there's no parentheses, so we have none. And our vertical shift is going to be down 3. So, to determine where our midline is, since we've got a vertical shift down 3, my midline is no longer going to be on the x-axis. It's going to be shifted down 3 units from the x-axis. So our midline should be here at y equals -3. My high line comes from my amplitude, so I go up 1 from my midline, and I go down 1 from my midline. And to graph cosine, we're going to graph high, middle, low, middle, high. So let's go ahead and identify our x scale. I always want you to write the x scale. Pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. Alright, so we're going to start with our first point being a high. Since there's no phase shift, that means I start when x is 0. X is 0 is here on the y-axis. I've got to start high. My last point is going to be a high point. How many units away? By our period, 2 pi units away. So 2 pi units is 4 spaces over, and we do a high point. Halfway between, we would do a low. So halfway between these two would be at pi on the low line. Halfway between our high and our low, we would do a middle. And halfway between our low and our high, we would do a middle. And so our curve would look like this. And all I need is one period. All right, let's check out what happens if we have a phase shift. So in example 4, we have an amplitude of 1, a period of 2 pi over b, or 2 pi over 2, which makes us have a period of pi units. This time we do have a phase shift. Our phase shift is plus pi over 2, which means it moves us to the left pi over 2 units. And lastly, vertical shift, we don't have one. Notice this graph is sine, so we're going to use the acronym middle, high, middle, low, middle. Okay, let's place our midline. Think about this. Do we have a vertical shift? No. So our midline is going to go on the x-axis. How do we find our high? By looking at our amplitude. Our amplitude is 1, so we go 1 unit up and 1 unit down. Let's label our x-axis in its scale. The first dash is going to be pi over 2, and again I'm going to do this at the bottom so it doesn't get so messy in here. And pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. Okay, now let's start plotting our points. My first middle point typically starts when x is 0, but I have a phase shift. It says start it left pi over 2 units. So instead of starting when x is 0, I'm going to go left pi over 2 units. Well, if I notice, pi over 2 units is 1 space away. So at negative pi over 2, I would want to put my first middle point. So this one's taken care of. Now we want to go to our last midline point. So our last point is how many units away? Well, that's determined by our period. We had a period change, and our period is pi units. So how many spaces is pi units? Well, that's 2 spaces from 0 to pi. But I don't put my last midline point right here at pi on the midline because I've started left pi over 2 units. So I want to go 2 spaces from where I started. 2 spaces from where I started would put my last midline point here at pi over 2. Then we do halfway to get our next middle point. Halfway between these two middles would be at the origin. And then we do our high and our low doing halfway between. Halfway between our 2 first middles is going to be high here. And halfway between our last 2 middles is going to be a low here. And so we have a graph that's shorter in period. Or we typically think of that as horizontally compressed. All right, now how about you hit pause and you try to identify the attributes of the next 4 graphs and graph those. Okay, so graph number 5 should look like this. We shifted up 1 unit, we have an amplitude of 2, and we're graphing the sine function that it has a period of 2 pi. So we start middle, We end 2 pi units later, and then we have halfway between middle, halfway between high, halfway between low. For number 6, we don't have a vertical shift, so our midline is on the x-axis. Our amplitude is 1, so we went up 1 for our high and down 1 for our low. Now on this one, we had a phase shift left pi over 2. So I went left and put my first point pi over 2 units to the left. I have a shortened period, so my last point is going to go pi over 2 units away from where I started. Pi over 2 units is 1 space, so my last point goes 1 space away. Halfway between, and then our high, and then our low. So this would be 1 period of our graph. For number 7, again, no vertical shift, so our midline is on the x-axis. Our amplitude is 3, so our high goes up 3 and down 3. Our period is shortened by pi, so when I'm placing my first point, since I don't have a phase shift and it's a cosine graph, x at 0 starts on the high. Since my period is shortened, it's only pi units. My next high point is 2 spaces away, or pi units away. Halfway between would be a low, halfway between would be middle, halfway between would be middle, and then we create our curve. And lastly, number 8 had all 4 pieces that were changed. So we had an amplitude of 2 and a vertical shift down 1. So our midline goes down 1, our high goes 2 units above and 2 units below. Since we had a phase shift right pi, instead of starting when x is 0, I start when x is pi units to the right. So cosine graph, I start high. Graphing my last high point, I've got to consider my period 4 pi units away. 4 pi units from where I started. 4 pi is 8 spaces. So from where I started, I'm going to count over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 spaces. Halfway between would be a low. Halfway between is a middle. Halfway between is a middle. And then we have our curve. All right, bring any questions you have to class tomorrow, and we will discuss this.